The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with wax that bore the Whitlock family crest. Margaret Doyle read it twice before setting it down carefully on her heavy pine desk. She had asked for a husband. They were sending their son, Nathaniel. But something about the letter disturbed her. The words spoke only of usefulness, of his practical nature, of a suitable temperament. They had none of the warmth one might expect from a family speaking of their son. It sounded as though they were giving away a tool, not a man. She stood and walked to the window, staring out across the long road that cut through her ranch. In 2 days' time, this Nathaniel Whitlock would arrive, the man she had requested, the son his family had chosen to send. Margaret had prepared herself for this moment, but now that it was near, her chest felt tight. Something about the haste, the eagerness in the letter unsettled her. What she didn't know was that miles away at the Whitlock homestead, Nathaniel was quietly packing his meager belongings. His sisters laughed together in another room, their voices carrying no concern for him. His father had called it perfect justice when Margaret's request came. His mother had smiled as if relieved when the decision was made. They had chosen him without hesitation, eager to see him gone. Nathaniel, though, carried secrets of his own secrets that explained their eagerness to be rid of him, and secrets that would soon tie his fate to Margaret's in ways neither of them could imagine. The next morning, Margaret scrubbed her home with an intensity that surprised even her. She swept dust from corners long neglected, polished the wooden table until it shone, and dressed the spare bedroom with fresh linens. From her mother's old trunk she pulled a chipped vase and placed wildflowers inside, setting it on the bedside table. She caught her reflection in the mirror near the door, smoothing a strand of auburn hair back into place. She was 30 years old, the owner of a vast ranch that rivaled any man's in the county. She was respected, sometimes begrudgingly, by neighbors who doubted a woman's ability to manage land and cattle. But in the quiet of her home, she knew the cost of her success. Loneliness pressed on her each year more heavily than the last. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to a memory 3 years past at Peterson's trading post. She had gone for supplies and seen the Whitlocks there, a well-dressed family of women laughing and bartering. A young man had stood apart, crouched over a stray dog, caught in a steel trap. His sisters had called to him, mocking him for dirtying his clothes. But he had ignored them, tearing strips from his own shirt to bind the dog's paw, speaking to it softly until it stopped trembling. Margaret had watched from a distance, struck by the kindness etched in his face. She had not forgotten it, even when the Whitlocks hurried him away as though ashamed. That had been Nathaniel. She realized now, after reading the letter, that he was the one they meant to send. At the Whitlock home, the decision had been made like a business deal. Edward Whitlock read Margaret's letter again and again, while his wife Agnes sat stiffly, her eyes bright with relief. Their daughters, Victoria and Isabel, exchanged knowing looks. Margaret Doyle was wealthy, they said. She had bought up the Morrison place and half the valley besides. "Perfect!" Isabel laughed. "Poor Nathaniel has no idea what's waiting for him." Edward insisted Nathaniel needn't be told more than necessary. "It's better this way," he muttered. Agnes's tone turned sharp. "For 3 years he's been a problem, always watching, always questioning. Since he was 16, he's brought nothing but shame. Let him be someone else's burden now." Nathaniel stood outside the kitchen door as they spoke, his back against the wall, the words striking like blows. Burden, shame, problem. He had always suspected, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. He did not burst in to confront them. He had learned that survival in this family meant silence, patience, thought. Later, in his grandmother's dim room, he held her frail hand and whispered what he had overheard. They were sending him away, marrying him to a stranger because they could not bear the trouble his honesty caused. She could not answer, but her weak grip gave him comfort. The next morning at breakfast, His father cleared his throat and told him of the arrangement. His mother added cheerlessly that Margaret Doyle was a good match, a wealthy rancher who would see he wanted for nothing. Nathaniel nodded, his face calm, his voice steady. They mistook his composure for obedience, as they always had. By Thursday, his trunk was packed. His family gathered on the porch to send him off, their smiles brittle, their eyes relieved. He climbed into the wagon without ceremony, without farewell. The journey carried him through rolling fields and autumn hills painted in gold. He watched the countryside pass, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He thought of the rancher who had written for him, and of the way she had once watched him at Peterson's post, not with scorn, not with ridicule, but with quiet recognition. The sun was sinking when the wagon turned into the lane that led to Twin Oaks. The ranch house stood strong against the horizon, its porch broad, its windows glowing with warm light. Before the driver had even stopped, Margaret stepped out onto the porch. Her stride was confident, her auburn hair catching the last blaze of the sunset. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, her hand extended. Nathaniel stepped down, his hand meeting hers. Her grip was firm, her green eyes sharp but not unkind. Something passed between them, a silent acknowledgment. Inside, the house was sturdy and warm, filled with furniture built for use rather than display, shelves lined with worn books, a fire crackling in the hearth. It felt like a home made for living, not for show. Margaret set his trunk aside and asked if he was hungry. He admitted he was, and she served stew and bread with quiet efficiency. They ate together at the heavy table. Margaret studied him, not with calculation, but with interest, as though she was measuring more than what she saw. At last she said, "Your family spoke highly of you." Nathaniel lifted an eyebrow. "Did they?" "Not really," she admitted, a faint smile curving her lips. "Your father was eager to agree, but said little of you. Your mother called you practical." "Practical," Nathaniel repeated with a dry laugh. "That's their polite way of saying unremarkable." "I don't think so," Margaret said. "I saw you once, years ago. You tended a wounded dog while your family mocked you. That wasn't unremarkable." Heat rose to his face. "You remember that?" "I remember thinking any man who'd ruin his shirt to save an animal was someone worth knowing," she replied. For a long moment, Nathaniel could not find his voice. For years, the very qualities she named had earned him scorn at home. Yet here was someone who saw them differently, who saw him differently. "Why me?" he asked softly. "Why send for me?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Because I need someone real. I don't need a man who poses or flatters. I need a partner who sees the world as it is. And when I remembered you that day at the post, I thought perhaps you might be that man." Nathaniel looked into her steady gaze, and for the first time in years, something inside him stirred that felt like hope. The morning light filtered pale and cool through the small window of the spare bedroom. Nathaniel stirred, blinking at the unfamiliar ceiling, the faint scent of smoke and coffee drifting from the kitchen. For a moment, he lay still, gathering himself. He had not expected to sleep so soundly in this place, but something about the quiet, the solid walls, the absence of sharp words, had allowed his body to rest. He rose, dressed in his plainest shirt, and stepped into the main room. Margaret stood at the stove, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled above her elbows, moving with an efficiency born of years of habit. She turned at the sound of his footsteps and held out a steaming cup. "Coffee?" He accepted with a quiet, "Thank you," wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "You're up early," he remarked. "Ranch work begins before the sun," she replied, cracking eggs into a pan. "But I don't expect you to keep my hours just yet." Nathaniel leaned against the doorway, studying her. She looked different in the morning light, less guarded, her face softened by the simple act of cooking. He was struck by how natural she seemed in her own kitchen, how steady. "What exactly do you hope to gain from this arrangement, Miss Doyle?" he asked, careful with his words. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Margaret," she corrected firmly. "And that's a fair question. I've built this ranch with my own hands, but the world looks harder at a woman alone. A partner adds stability, security, even if only in appearance. But I don't want a hollow partnership. I want someone I can work alongside, someone who sees things as they are. That's what I asked for when I wrote to your father." Nathaniel set his coffee down on the table, his brow furrowing. "And you believe I'm that someone?" "I believe you might be." They ate their breakfast in companionable quiet, though Nathaniel was acutely aware of how intently she watched him, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. She was assessing him, he realized, much the way she would assess a horse or a parcel of land carefully, with patience, looking for what lay beneath the surface. When they had finished, she pushed back her chair. "Come, I'll show you the ranch. It's only right you know what sort of place you've agreed to." "No." They walked side by side across the wide yard, the crisp autumn air alive with the scent of damp earth. Margaret pointed out the barn, the chicken coops, the pasture where cattle grazed in quiet clusters. Nathaniel listened, absorbing the pride in her voice, the way her hand rested on the wooden rail as if the land itself were part of her. "It's larger than I expected," he admitted. 5 years of stubborn work," she said simply. "I started with little more than the land itself and 2 good horses. Everything you see now was built piece by piece." He studied her profile. As she spoke, the strength in her jaw, the sun-browned skin, the steadiness in her green eyes. There was nothing fragile about her. She had carved her life from this harsh country and made it something enduring. He felt a flicker of respect that deepened with every step they took. At the fence line of her largest pasture, she paused, arms resting on the top rail. The cattle shifted lazily in the distance, their shapes small against the endless horizon. Nathaniel joined her, feeling the weight of the open space settle over him. After years in his father's house, under the constant pressure of disapproval, the air here felt strangely clean. "Can I tell you something?" Margaret asked, her voice quieter now. "Of course. I didn't choose your family at random." She turned to face him fully, her eyes steady on his. 3 years ago, after I saw you at Peterson's post, I asked questions. I wanted to know about the Whitlocks, about you. I learned your father's dealings are not always honest, but that you were different. You spoke against him, even when it cost you." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He had guarded those truths carefully, yet here she was, laying them bare. "So that was it," he said slowly. "You didn't want a husband. You wanted a source, someone who could tell you more about my father's business." "That's what I thought I wanted," she admitted, her gaze never wavering. "But then you arrived, and I'm beginning to wonder if I was wrong." He swallowed hard. "How can you be sure?" Instead of answering, she lifted a hand, the rough pads of her fingers brushing lightly against his cheek. The touch was gentle, startling in its tenderness. Nathaniel froze, his breath caught, then found himself leaning into it, the warmth spreading through him. "Because somewhere between yesterday and this morning," Margaret said softly, "I stopped caring about your father's business and started caring about you." Her words struck something deep inside him, a place that had known nothing but dismissal and contempt. "And who do you think I am when no one is watching?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. "I think you're someone brave enough to do what's right, even when it costs you, someone honest when it would be easier to lie, someone who doesn't look away from pain." She hesitated, then added, "And I think you are worth more than your family ever allowed you to believe." For a moment, the world around them stilled the rustle of cattle, the cry of a hawk overhead, the shifting wind. Nathaniel's pulse beat hard in his throat. No one had ever spoken of him that way, not in earnest. "What happens now?" he whispered. Her thumb brushed against his jaw. "Now we decide if we want this to be real." The decision was made in silence. He closed the distance between them, and she rose slightly on her toes, and when their lips met, the kiss was soft but certain, the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. It deepened, warmed, until they pulled apart breathless, their foreheads resting together, the space between them erased. Nathaniel exhaled shakily. "You need to know whatever reason my family had for sending me. None of it matters to me anymore. I may have been a burden to them, but here," his voice faltered, "here, I want to be more than that." Margaret's hands framed his face, steady and sure. "You already are. Whatever they thought they were ridding themselves of, they've given me something I've been searching for. A partner who values truth more than appearances." He felt his chest tighten again, this time not with pain, but with something dangerously close to joy. For years he had been cast aside, and now this woman, strong and unflinching, saw him clearly and wanted him as he was. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Nathaniel rose with Margaret before dawn, joining her in the chores. At first she told him he need not, but he insisted. Together they fed the horses, tended the cattle, hauled water, and mended fences. He was no stranger to hard work, though his father had always treated it as punishment rather than necessity. Working beside Margaret, he found satisfaction in the labor, in the shared effort that built something lasting. Evenings were spent by the fire, simple meals of stew or cornbread filling their stomachs, quiet conversation filling the silence. Margaret spoke of the ranch's early days, of long winters and lean summers, of neighbors who doubted her, of the endless struggle against weather and debt. Nathaniel listened, his admiration deepening with each story. In return, he offered fragments of his own past, the arguments with his father, the truths he had spoken that no one wanted to hear, the loneliness of living under constant censure. One night, as rain tapped against the windows, Margaret asked him a question that made him pause. "Why did your family agree so quickly to my request?" Nathaniel's fingers stilled on the mug he was holding. He stared into the fire, the flames blurring. "Because I was easier to send away than to silence. I've spent years pointing out what they wanted ignored. My sisters call it meddling. My parents call it shame. To them, I am not a son, but an inconvenience." Her hand reached across the table, covering his. "You're not an inconvenience here." The words lodged in his chest like a promise. He looked up at her, meeting her steady gaze, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe it might be true. 3 weeks passed, the season turning colder, the nights longer. The decision to wed came not as a grand declaration, but as the natural conclusion to the bond that had already taken root. A traveling preacher came through, and in a simple ceremony with 2 ranch hands as witnesses, Margaret and Nathaniel spoke their vows. She wore her best dress, plain but well mended. He wore a shirt scrubbed clean and boots polished until they shone. Their hands clasped firmly, their voices steady. The Whitlocks sent no word, no congratulations, no acknowledgement, but neither of them cared. The vows were theirs, the life ahead of them theirs alone. That evening, after the preacher had gone and the ranch hands returned to their quarters, they sat together on the porch beneath a sky scattered with stars. Nathaniel's hand rested in Margaret's, warm and solid. "Any regrets?" she asked quietly. He shook his head, turning his face toward her. "Only that it took us 3 years to speak honestly." She smiled, leaning into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "Then we have the rest of our lives to make up for it." And in the stillness of that night, with the land stretching endless before them and the weight of the past lifting, they both knew it was enough. Winter settled over Twin Oaks with a sharpness that made every chore harder. The mornings were brittle with frost, the cattle's breath rising in white plumes across the pasture, the ground stiff beneath boots. Nathaniel rose with Margaret each day, their rhythm now second nature, feeding the animals, breaking ice in the water troughs, hauling hay. It was grueling work, but he found satisfaction in it. Each swing of the axe, each fence repaired, each calf led safely back to the herd, felt like another brick in a foundation he was helping to build. Neighbors began to take notice. Margaret Doyle had long been considered formidable in her independence, admired by some, criticized by others. Whispers followed her whenever she rode into town. A woman running a spread that large, a woman who didn't bow to expectations. Now those whispers turned toward Nathaniel, too. Some pitied him, assuming he was a man content to let himself be absorbed by his wife's land and wealth. Others watched with suspicion, wondering what kind of arrangement had been struck. One evening, as they rode back from checking fence lines, Margaret mentioned it without ceremony. "Folks in town are talking." Nathaniel guided his horse over a rut and said nothing for a long moment. "About me, I expect." "About us," she corrected. "Some think you're after the ranch. Some think I've gone soft, taking in a man so quickly. They don't understand why." "Do you care?" he asked. Her green eyes cut toward him, steady and unflinching. "If I worried about what people thought, this ranch wouldn't exist. Let them talk." Her bluntness steadied him. Yet later that night, when he lay beside her listening to the wind rattle the shutters, he found himself wondering how long it would be before the shadows of his family reached them here. That shadow arrived sooner than he expected. It was a cold Sunday when they rode into town for supplies. The general store was warm with lamplight, the air thick with the smell of flour, coffee beans, and tobacco. Margaret greeted the shopkeeper with her usual brisk nod, while Nathaniel busied himself gathering nails and lamp oil. He was at the counter when a familiar voice stopped him cold. "Well, if it isn't my wayward brother." He turned to find Victoria standing just inside the door, her blonde hair tucked beneath a fine hat, her lips curved in a smile that did not reach her eyes. Isabel was beside her, wrapped in a fur-lined coat. Both looked wildly out of place in the rough little town, but they carried themselves as though the room belonged to them. Nathaniel's chest tightened. "What are you doing here?" "Visiting," Victoria said lightly. "Surely we're allowed to see how our brother fares with his new circumstances." Her gaze flicked toward Margaret, who had come to stand at his side, her posture protective, chin lifted. Margaret extended her hand politely. "Margaret Doyle." "Of course," Isabel replied with false sweetness. "The woman who thought to tame our Nathaniel. How ambitious of you." The shopkeeper, sensing tension, busied himself with a barrel of oats at the far end of the store. The sisters drew closer, their voices low but sharp. "Father is pleased," Victoria said, eyes narrowing at Nathaniel. "Your marriage solves a great many of our problems, but he wonders how long it will last, given your tendencies." "Tendencies?" Margaret asked, her tone cool. Isabel's smile turned sly. "He has a habit of asking too many questions, meddling in matters that don't concern him. Surely you've noticed by now." Margaret's hand brushed Nathaniel's arm, a quiet reassurance. "I've noticed he values honesty. That's no flaw." The sisters exchanged a glance, then leaned closer. "Be careful," Victoria murmured. "A ranch as large as yours attracts attention, and not all of it friendly. Father has friends in places you wouldn't expect." With that, they swept from the store, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and a silence that felt heavy. Margaret turned to Nathaniel, her jaw tight. "What was that?" "My sisters," he said flatly. And a warning, though dressed up as concern. On the ride home, she pressed him for more. Reluctantly, he told her of the contracts his father had twisted, the neighbors cheated, the judge's nephew shielded from scandal. He spoke of how he had uncovered these things, how his refusal to remain silent had made him a liability. "They sent you to me to be rid of you," Margaret said when he finished, her voice hard with anger. He nodded once. "They thought you'd keep me occupied, or that the distance would quiet me." Her hands tightened on the reins. Then they miscalculated. The following weeks carried an undercurrent of unease. Margaret and Nathaniel worked side by side as always, but both were more watchful. When a section of fence collapsed mysteriously, Nathaniel inspected the ground and found boot prints not belonging to either of them. When 2 cattle turned up missing, Margaret rode the perimeter herself, jaw clenched, eyes sharp, though no tracks led beyond the far creek. One night, as they sat before the fire, Nathaniel finally said what had been pressing on him. "They won't let us alone, not if your ranch threatens their dealings." Margaret set aside her mending and looked at him steadily. "Then we stand against them, together." It was a simple declaration, but in her voice he heard the same resolve that had built Twin Oaks from nothing. It steadied him in ways nothing else could. Spring came late, the thaw slow, the fields muddy underfoot. With it came renewed whispers in town. A neighbor warned Margaret quietly that Edward Whitlock had been seen speaking with men from the county office. "Landmen," the neighbor said. "Surveyors. Folks who know how to twist a boundary line if they're paid right." Margaret rode home with her jaw set, anger burning in her chest. That evening she told Nathaniel, "If they try to take this land—" "They won't," he interrupted. "Not while I draw breath." But even as he said it, he knew how ruthless his father could be. He had seen men lose everything with a single forged document or a whispered lie in the right ear. It was Margaret who steadied him then. She placed her hand on his, her eyes fierce. "This ranch was built with sweat and blood. No paper trick will undo that. And if they come here looking for a fight, they'll find one." Her strength poured into him, and he realized then that she had given him more than a home. She had given him a place to stand, a place where he was no longer a burden, but a partner. Their bond deepened, forged in work and in the quiet moments after. At night, lying together in the hush of the house, Nathaniel would listen to her breathing, steady and strong, and feel something he had never known in his father's house: peace. But peace was fragile, and as summer crept over the land, the Whitlocks made their next move. It began with strangers riding the boundary lines, clipboards in hand, muttering about surveys. It spread with rumors in town, whispers that Margaret's claim to Twin Oaks was flawed, that part of her land rightly belonged to the Whitlocks. Nathaniel recognized his father's hand in it immediately. One evening, after running off 2 men poking around near the north pasture, Margaret slammed the door behind her, cheeks flushed with fury. "They mean to steal it, piece by piece under cover of law." Nathaniel took her shoulders, steadying her. "Then we fight it with truth. That's what I've always done." She looked up at him, eyes fierce. And in that moment he saw not only the rancher who had built Twin Oaks, but the partner who had chosen him, when no one else would. He kissed her then, a fierce, grounding kiss, as if sealing a vow. "Let them come," she said when they broke apart. "This land won't be taken easily." And as the cicadas sang outside and the twilight deepened, both knew that the real battle had only just begun. The summer heat pressed down heavy, the kind that made sweat bead on the skin before the day was an hour old. Margaret and Nathaniel worked side by side in the fields, but both carried the weight of unease. The Whitlocks' games had grown bolder. Surveyors rode the land with forged maps. Rumors crept through town like wildfire, claims that Margaret's deeds were flawed, that Twin Oaks sat on land never properly filed, that the Whitlocks had rights she had stolen. Margaret, who had faced blizzards, droughts, and sickness, found her anger harder to bear than any storm. She'd built her ranch fair and square, never cheated anyone, never cut corners. Now men in neat coats with county seals strutted across her pasture as though they owned it. One late afternoon, after chasing off a pair of them with rifles slung over their shoulders, Margaret rode back to the house, dust clinging to her skin. Nathaniel was waiting on the porch. The look on his face told her he had news. "They've filed papers in county court," he said, voice taut, "claiming 30 acres on the northern boundary. If the judge rules for them, it cuts off the water rights." Margaret swore under her breath, her hands tightening on the reins. "That's the heart of the ranch. Without the creek, Twin Oaks starves." "They're betting you won't fight," Nathaniel said, "or that you'll be too proud to ask for help." "Then they don't know me." That night, by lamplight, Nathaniel spread the old deeds across the table. Margaret leaned close, scanning the ink, the careful signatures, the county seals faded with age. Her mother's hand was among them, the woman who had once stood beside her to claim the land when neighbors said it couldn't be done. "Every line is in order," Margaret said, tracing the edges. "The only way they can win is if the judge is already in their pocket." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He knew how his father operated. Bribes, favors, whispered, threats. Edward Whitlock rarely lost once he set his mind. "I can testify," Nathaniel said finally. "I know what he's done, the contracts he's twisted, the lies he's told. If the court hears it, they'll see this for what it is." Margaret caught his hand. "That means standing against your own blood in public. Are you ready for that?" He met her gaze, steady, certain. "I've been ready since the day they sent me away." The hearing was set for late July. Word spread fast. On the morning they rode into town, half the county seemed to have gathered outside the courthouse, curious to see if the famed Margaret Doyle and her quiet husband could stand against the powerful Whitlocks. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with dust and anticipation. The judge, a stout man with a reddened face, presided from his high bench. Edward Whitlock sat at a polished table flanked by his daughters, Victoria with her lips pursed tight, Isabel smirking faintly. Nathaniel avoided their eyes. He kept his focus on Margaret, who sat upright beside him, her expression as firm as stone. Edward's lawyer spoke first, unfurling documents and pointing at maps. He painted Margaret as careless, her deeds as flawed, her claim as illegitimate. "My clients," he declared, "only seek what is rightfully theirs, what was stolen decades ago through oversight." Margaret's fists clenched on the table, but she held her tongue. When their turn came, she stood and spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. She told of how her mother had filed the claim, how every survey had been certified, how every acre had been worked and defended with sweat and honest labor. Then Nathaniel rose. All eyes turned to him, the Whitlock son who had been cast out. He spoke not with anger but with calm precision, recounting contracts his father had twisted, land stolen from neighbors, deals brokered through intimidation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The judge shifted uneasily in his chair. Victoria's face drained of color. Isabel hissed under her breath. Edward's jaw locked, but he did not speak. For the first time, Nathaniel saw something like fear in his father's eyes. When he finished, the courtroom was silent, but for the creak of wood and the scratching of the clerk's pen, the judge cleared his throat. "The deeds stand. Twin Oaks remains in Margaret Doyle's possession. The Whitlock claim is denied." A roar of voices filled the room. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Nathaniel felt her hand grip his beneath the table, strong and steady. Edward rose, his face purple with rage. "You'll regret this, boy," he spat, his voice low but venomous. "No," Nathaniel replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I regret nothing." They left the courthouse to a sea of townsfolk. Some cheered, some whispered, but all watched as Margaret and Nathaniel mounted their horses and rode away side by side. The ride home was long, the sun sinking low. the fields glowing amber in the light. Neither spoke for miles, the weight of what had passed settling around them. At last, Margaret broke the silence. "You've severed yourself from them," she said softly. "I was severed long ago," Nathaniel answered. Today only made it clear. She reached across, brushing his hand where it rested on the reins. "Then you are wholly mine now, and Twin Oaks is wholly ours." The weeks that followed were quiet but not without challenge. Men loyal to the Whitlocks lurked near the borders, muttering threats, but none dared step openly onto the land. Nathaniel remained vigilant, riding the perimeter each dawn, rifle across his saddle. Margaret worked beside him, unflinching. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, Nathaniel stood with her at the fence line. The cattle moved lazily in the distance, the air warm with the hum of crickets. "You've given me more than a home," he said quietly. "You've given me a place to belong, a life I never thought I'd have." "Dan." Margaret turned to him, her eyes steady, her expression softening. "And you've given me what I never dared hope for, a partner I can trust with my land, with my heart, with everything I am." He took her hand, roughened by work, and pressed it to his lips. The silence of the evening wrapped around them, broken only by the steady beat of their hearts. Autumn came again, the leaves turning gold, the air crisp with promise. The ranch thrived, calves born strong, fields yielding well. The Whitlocks retreated into their own bitterness, their power diminished. Nathaniel and Margaret stood together through it all, their bond only stronger for the trials faced. On a clear night beneath a sky thick with stars, they sat once more on the porch, as they had after their wedding. Nathaniel's arms circled Margaret's shoulders, her head rested against him. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't written that letter?" she asked quietly. He thought a long while before answering. "I think we would still have found each other somehow. You don't lose what was meant to be found." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes on the endless sky. "Then let's make sure we never lose it." He kissed her temple, holding her close. The land stretched wide and silent before them, honest and enduring, a reflection of the life they had built together. And in the hush of that night, with all the trials behind them and the future open before them, Margaret Doyle and Nathaniel Whitlock knew they had not only survived but prevailed. What had begun as an arrangement of convenience had become the truest partnership, forged in honesty, tempered by struggle, and bound by a love neither had expected, but both now could not imagine living without. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super thanks to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.